Okay. The recording is started. I've got so many people here. How are you doing? Can anybody who's attending by Zoom, can you let me know that you can hear me?
Yes, Professor, we can hear you, but we couldn't see you.
Can you see me?
No.
Oh, why can't you see me? Oh, maybe I can ask. Maybe I'll ask why they can't. Hang on, I'll be right back. I don't know why you can't see me, because this is being recorded. Maybe I have to turn something on. Oh, maybe there's something here. Oh, start video. Can you see me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, just a simple press of the button. Okay. What I'm going to do is give some context to everything that we've learned so far. You want me to enable it? Okay. Okay, when I started teaching in this program, when I was asked to teach in this program, I come from a very passionate perspective on working in the field of mental health and addictions. This is not just a course. Like, this has been my whole life, is working with people who have struggled with emotional or mental health or behavioral issues. So I come with that drive and I come with that passion. And when I'm teaching this information, my background, and I think it's really important because that's kind of going to direct a lot of what you're going to hear from me, it comes from a position of understanding that I believe information promotes understanding. And when we understand something, we're less likely to judge. Because all of you have chosen to take a course where you're going to become a mental health professional. You're going to be working in the trenches, or you're going to be working at some level, on an interpersonal level, with someone who's struggling with mental health and addictions. Okay? And that when we learn about, and when we, especially this first part of the course, when we talked about the biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual perspective of mental health and addictions, why that's so important to look at and to understand, is that when we learn about why someone is who they are, it helps us understand the present. That when we learn about someone's past, it puts context to their present, right? And even though someone may have a diagnosis of a concurrent disorder, if you have that diagnosis, you have that diagnosis, you have that diagnosis, your history, what happened to you in your past, your own biology, your own psychological makeup, your own social upbringing, whether you witness domestic violence, whether you have, what your coping skills are, your nature, all that matters, because when I'm working with you and I'm sitting with you, if I understand who you are and how you got to be where you are right now at this point in your life, how I interact with you, the strategies are going to change. They will be modified to you as an individual. It's not one size fits all, right? And working from a perspective, since our past is never going to change, it's done, it's a fait accompli, is that what do we do with it now, except understand it and pull from it resilience? Because when we look at the biopsychosocial model, I want people to understand how critical that is, because not only just for example, if you were to take out a sheet of paper right now, this is a review. Like if we were looking at, maybe, I won't do an official review for your midterm, but if I was to ask you, can you give me at least 3 components of the biological component of the biopsychosocial model? Can you? What are they? Give me three. What are three things we consider under the biological model?
Genetics. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to
Yes,
answer.
genetics. Thank you.
Individual brain chemistry and IQ, I know we talked about.
Yes. Okay, so those would be some of the components. What would be, give me three components that you would look at under someone's psychological makeup?
So we talked about their nature, which I know was relating to also biological perspectives, just like how their brain chemistry works and stuff like that. And we were talking about trauma. So past traumas in their life that may affect.
That's social, that's social.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Environment, so environment.
That's social. When you talk about someone's own psychology, and their own psychological makeup, their coping skills, it's who they are from when they were born. It's their sort of inherent nature. The difference between someone that you have 5 kids in a family and not one of them are the same, right? They may have similar traits, they may look alike, but they're very different when you look at your own family. That's your own individual makeup, your coping skills, your individual, your stress management skills, whether you're determined, whether you're kind of shy or more withdrawn. These are all in your notes, but it's also in the lectures that we've talked about before. And it's understanding this different component. Now the social, the environment, the social elements are really critical to understand. And I think we've had a few people have addressed those. Someone's environment, that's why we studied, that's why we looked at Grothenbrenner. When you're sitting with someone and you get who's in their microsystem, who was in their microsystem, were they part of sports? What were their parenting? Who were their parents? Were they part of a team? Because if they played for a team, you learned that they were able to take direction, that they had social skills, they were able to, may have self-esteem issues. When you look at, was there a history of trauma, abuse? Where was their support system? Were they raised within a traditional family, or were they raised within, were they raised by their grandparents? Did they have were they had any involvement with the child welfare system? Was there abuse, the social determinants of health? Where did poverty play? All these variables, your brain goes off in 1,000 different directions. It's like when you're sitting with someone, you're very quiet, right? And then you're asking these questions. I was just talking to the students earlier this morning, is that one of the most critical courses you're going to take is going to be counseling and interviewing. Because you can have all this knowledge, you can know all this, and it won't mean squat. If you can't sit with someone and them be safe with you, because you understand and you don't judge, that you genuinely want to get to know who they are. How did this all happen? When I asked you when we talked about Grothenbrenner and getting that information, and then when I talked about doing a genogram, a timeline, this is how I get to know somebody. This is where I get to see their strengths. This is when we find things like their resilience. When I do a timeline on someone, it's a simple line, but what it says is it tracks their history from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the events that happened in their life. It's a living document that as you work with someone, that triggers memories, and then you just become more informed. But the whole time, these are all in your notes, by the way, this is all in your PowerPoints, this information, that you become aware of their strengths and their abilities. They don't see it. I told you the story of those 2 girls that took off on the elevator. When they came, remember, they dyed their hair, they had a change of clothes, they did all that stuff. That could be seen as a really negative behavior. Anybody could look at it that way. That's not what our job is as mental health professionals, is to see the strengths in what seems to be awful, or a really, defiant behavior. And that's your job when you do these, when I asked you, or I introduced to you all these different tools, because these tools take you from where where they are to potentially where they want to go, right? But you have to sit and you have to hear their story. That's why the recommended reading is Gabor Mate in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, because that's his strategy. He's the most gentle man. Did anybody YouTube him? Anybody researching that? Okay, I would suggest if you don't buy the book, at the very least, search him out and listen to him. Listen to his voice, listen to his tone, listen to his kindness, listen to his humility. This is he's world renowned and probably one of the most humble men you'll ever want to hear, because he actually talks about his own addiction. So he comes from a place of humility, and genuinely, I think we have to do the same thing. That was your first assignment. And I don't know that people understood how critical that assignment was, and I can address it now because the due date is passed for submissions, right? Is that I asked you to look at one of your behaviors. Something that you engage in that is counterindicated for your health, your mental health, your physical health, your well-being. This wasn't a flippant exercise by any means, right? This was an introduction to, yes?
I am confused for the structure, social and structure psychology.
The biopsychosocial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I understand the structure will have to do with the location, with the country. This is social.
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
You're totally understanding it, because those are the things, this is why we talk about the biopsychosocial spiritual model, right? Dr. Engel in 1977 created the biopsychosocial model, right?
Yeah.
But since then, it has evolved and it is now incorporating cultural and spiritual understandings, because that influences us. If you were raised in a Catholic home, that you were raised to do certain things and obey and do this, so you were raised with this faith. You were raised with the belief that there is a God, that you will get strength, and you will, if you pray, that God will answer your prayers, and that you don't necessarily have to do anything. Some other being, some superior being, supreme being is going to come in and adjust your life for you and make things happen. And when we truly believe that, there's different schools of thought on this. It's almost controversial, because other people are atheists and they still can handle problems in life, kind of thing, right? That culture really creates roles for women, roles for men, roles for children. They're seen, they're not heard, and they're seen, but they're not heard, depending on how you were raised, what culture you were raised in, what emotional culture you were raised in. Were you raised in a family that valued children and that their voices should be heard? Or were you raised in a patriarchal society where the males were the dominant and that women were subservient? That still exists in many parts of the world, right? That if you are raised in that kind of environment, that creates your internal dialogue. That creates your belief system and how you walk in the world, right? So you're 100% right. It's interesting from a spiritual perspective, that some of the treatment models, and one of the most successful treatment models is AA for alcoholics. And that all has to do with surrendering to a higher power, whatever someone perceives that higher power to be. But it's a very religious, very spiritual way of looking at addictions and treating addictions. And that works for some people. But do I believe in that stuff? Am I spiritual? Yes, I'm very spiritual. Is it because I was raised that way? Maybe. But do I believe that people who have died, when you think of Teresa Caputo, has anybody ever seen the Long Island medium?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, is that she has this ability to communicate with people who have passed on. Do I believe that exists? How do you explain some of this stuff? I don't know, some of it is out there, right? So there's nothing is proven, right? We don't really know things, but even when we get into medications and we talk about depression, that there's even, the CAMH even will talk about how antidepressants seem to, that's the word they use, seem to have an impact on someone's mental health. There's all kinds of studies that have been done from non-traditional ways of dealing with depression that suggest that, and they're placebos. That people are given placebos and other people are given actual antidepressants, and the success rates are incredibly high with this placebo effect. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we really are incredibly powerful? What we believe about ourselves, what we think we're capable of, can surmount, but then we can't negate the science of neurology and neuroscience and the understanding of neurotransmitters. So how do we join these two worlds? And it's almost like this is what we do when we're in the field of mental health and addictions. We're working within the spiritual world, the cultural world, we're working within neurodiversity, and we're also working within just an understanding of the human existence. It's very complex, but this is what's more important about that is where you stand. Because you're the one that's sitting, if you're working in the field, you're coming to talk to me. I'm struggling with a Xanax addiction, but that I have a whole history of sexual abuse. You're gonna sit there very nicely and you're gonna be able to connect to me. What is your ability? What point of view, what framework do you come from? What's your belief system? That's why I had you, that's one of the reasons I had you do that exercise, that first one, is that decision-making is that you were to look at a behavior that you have that's counterindicated. And that is an exercise in humility. Right off the hop, who the hell do we think we are? If anybody actually goes in this field with a superior attitude, people are gonna read it right away. I'm gonna give you an example. You all got my email last week about me having to create a frickin' YouTube video. I have never done, I'm a master's in social work. I don't have a tech background, right? In fact, and I'm older, so I mean, it doubles up in terms of levels of frustration. So I find out that I can't upload it. I have to create a YouTube channel, and then I have to take it and download it. Now, it's interesting. The person that I ended up having to work with, it was such an incredible example of how important it is when you feel incompetent, when you don't feel like you have the skill or ability and you feel dumb, and how someone handled that. I lived it last week, right? And this is how real this work is, right? Is that I felt like an idiot. I'll tell you the truth. That it's like, oh, well, you should do this. It's like, I don't know how to do it. And I'm almost like, I can't curse on because this is being recorded, but I'll tell you what I felt like saying. And so what ended up happening is I had to get my granddaughter. She created the YouTube channel for me. And then my son helped me download the damn thing. Now that they taught me, and they did it in a way that was respectful and I didn't feel stupid, and I didn't feel like I was incompetent, or is that they were understanding, okay, of course you don't know it, you haven't been taught this. Because of how they did it, it was so easy for me to say, thank you. It was so easy for me to admit my humanness and that vulnerability I had when it came to this. So now I can go to them when when I don't know something, because I don't feel like I'm going to be judged. It's no different. I lived that last week. And this is our field as well, is that for someone to be able to sit with us and not feel that they generally don't judge us. They generally want to know what's happened in their lives and what is it you want out of your life? Where do you want to go? That's why we're going to be you're eventually going to be doing the stages of change, the trans-theoretical model of change. You're going to be learning about that and how you incorporate that in your work. But at the very beginning, I asked you to look at one behavior you had, because that required you to look at yourself and say, I'm not perfect. I have addictions. We all have addictions. We all have, whether we smoke, whether we vape, whether we overthink, whether we watch TV too much, whether we video, whatever we all have that vulnerability. We're no better than anybody else, right? And that exercise in humility also involved you not only looking at, but also doing the critical analysis that's required that you're going to be doing with people in the field. Is that there, you know what? People use drugs because there's good things about them. And so we have to know what the good things are if we're going to counteract it with something. And then we have to look at what the not so good things are. And so we're doing this checks and balances all the time, right? Then the other questions were, what would motivate you to change? Unless, hi, welcome. Unless you are motivated, if there's not a reason, you're not going to change. And it's not for somebody else, it's not for your kids, you're not gonna quit smoking. If you don't do it for you, in the middle of the night when it's just you alone with your thoughts, you're the one battling with yourself. It doesn't matter, so that level of commitment. So what is your motivation? Motivation is the secret to hope. If you don't have that, and you help have people locate that. There was a lot of really flimsy answers, that's okay, that's fine. Right? Because I don't know that anybody appreciated the seriousness of the assignment. You're going to go back to this assignment in your final exam. I'll give you a heads up on that right now. Because you started with this body of knowledge, and you're going to have a whole bunch of information between now and when you end this course on your final exam, and you're going to loop back to that. Because if you don't loop back, it doesn't make sense. You have to make sense of the learning. It all has to connect. Then I asked you what would be involved in changing. Some people missed the last question. That's okay. That also says, oh, I missed the last question. You can't miss information when you're working in the field. You got to read the whole assignment. You've got to read through everything. It's not fair to the people you're working with to skip over stuff, right? Oh, I don't need to read this. It's like, yeah, you do, right? You don't have to watch the videos. You don't have to watch the whole videos. You can play them and, be making supper in the background and pretend you watched it. I've seen people do that as well, depending on how committed you are to actually learning the material. So and it's not learning the material for me, and it's not learning the material so you get an 80 or a 90. It's not why you're learning this. Learning it because you're a mental health professional and that you're going to be impacting people's lives. That's why you learn this stuff, right? So the assignment asks you to look at, so what would you have to do? It's interesting, everybody targeted a behavior, and it's like, okay, so why haven't you changed it? You know it's a problem. You've all identified it. Well, but who the hell's changed? No one's changed it. I'd be interesting. Well, I think I should start now. I would really like to know if anybody actually did start now, because you know what? It's hard to start change when there's so much stuff going on in your life. You're going to school. That's why I asked you the very first day, what are you? You're a mom, you're a sister, you're a daughter, you're an employee, you're many, many things that when we're talking about changing people's lives and going in and parachuting into people's lives, is that we've got all these answers and these solutions and these theories and this incredible body of knowledge you're going to walk away with. But it's like, but there's so much stuff going on. And I got to know your life and all the different variables that impact your life. And you'll see on some of the assignments, because people want to make changes and they're going to lose weight or they're going to eat healthier. You have any idea how much money you're talking about here? I bought a bag of apples last week because I have $12. It's like, are you kidding? And that's not the organic ones. Exactly. I want to buy the healthy ones, but even then you're on a budget, right? But if you want to eat healthy, it's easy people to say that. You can't be that flippant about you want to do these things, because what does that mean? I want to stop overthinking. Okay, well, how do you do that? What's the process? How are you going about this? Without a plan, nothing's going to work. It's just all talk and it becomes an assignment. But that was supposed to be that way. Because it's like, oh my God, there's so much more involved in change. And it's when we start looking at those dynamics, wait till we do the transitory radical model of change, and how many variables, how at the third stage, how much work is involved, because that's the plan that will make it work, right? Okay.
I just had Sorry, I just had a quick question. Are we gonna receive feedback for the assignment in the assignment as like notes, or are you gonna
Well, I don't know
email
how
it
to do
us?
that, because you guys are a distance. I don't know if I mail it to you or,
Okay.
this is the problem when people are attending from a distance. I don't know how I get it. Is there any way that Jenny can get it to you? Are you attending any class in person, or where do you live?
Well, I was just like, you can email it to us, I guess. Because I was just
I
wondering
have to
if you had.
scan it. I have to scan. I'm gonna get somebody else to do that. But, and this is where I set my limits as well. I'm part-time, right? I used to be full-time, so I would put in 60 hours a week and it wouldn't matter because I got paid really well, right? So, but right now, when you're working part-time, you want to get paid for the 3 hours that you teach. I can tell you right off the hop right now, I do way more than that, only because that's the way I've always worked. But extending over and above, so I'd have to ask Jenny if she could scan it and email it to you, because I don't have that equipment at home, and I don't have an office here. I don't have that equipment here, because you are part-time, because I am part-time. So,
Okay. Okay, thank you. I was just wondering.
I don't know, I could see if she could email it, because they did write comments on it. But you know what the thing is, when we actually, I've asked all of you to keep a copy of it. When we go through the trans-theoretical model of change, bring it, sit with it, and then do it again, right? And see if things would change and how you would enhance that. How about if we do that? And you can do your own self-analysis and your own critique kind of thing. And eventually I can get it to you. I don't know, maybe after all your assignments, I can mail them all to you or something. I can give Jenny the mail to you, because some of you, where are you attending from? Is it Denver that was talking? Who was talking? Who asked that question? It was Denver? Okay, where do you live, Denver? Hold on. Okay. So that was putting just a context and thing. The other thing I wanted to talk about is your next assignment is gonna be your, there's gonna be a presentation from Sassy. I had to revise that syllabus one more time. I'm hoping that's the end of it. Because with Sean and Joel actually confirming their dates, they had to work with their employers to see what dates they could actually attend. So I received confirmation so that you'll see changes on your syllabus. Now Joel's coming in from Sassy. This man is incredible. He's actually coming on campus, which is amazing. And he is a registered nurse. He works in the trenches for Sassy. He brings a whole, and I think you know him already. And so he's gonna bring a whole different perspective, but he's incredibly bright, and you may have to be able to follow his train of thought. And then the other person, actually Sean, is an alcoholic, a recovered alcoholic. He'll talk to you about his journey. So I can talk to you about stuff, but this is someone who's gonna actually tell you, he's walked the walk, he's talking the talk, and he's going to provide you with information. So it just, again, adds to your level of understanding about the lived experience. So this rubric, so you know that there's changes in the syllabus. Your responsibility, because I sent it to you, is to check the due dates. And I gave you all the assignments ahead of time as to what is expected. But the third assignment is the actual drug research that I'm going to be asking you to do. But you have to do it in pairs. There's too many of you. There's no way we could fit in, because part of it's the presentation. The last part of the assignment is actually with your partner presenting your research. And that means that there are going to be 14 or 15, you're going to have in-depth knowledge about 14 or 15 drugs that are actually used and are actually highly associated with concurrent disorders. You could research that yourself, but you're not going to have to, because as colleagues, our job is to share our knowledge and our information with each other. And so this is what you're going to be doing. Not only are you going to research the drug, and I'm going to send you a copy of the expectations, right? Because all the information in that assignment becomes very critical. When I ask for something like the cost of the drug or the street cost, It's significant because heroin or cocaine versus speed is very different, and how much more accessible it is, how cheaper it is, that, you know, cocaine being the rich man's drug kind of thing. And so why you would see different drugs at different, in different socioeconomic classes, and that becomes important. Why you have criminal activity highly associated with drug use because of the cost of, like, when you start talking about Oxycontin and you start looking at how expensive that is, and if someone has a $240 or $280 a day habit, where are they getting those resources from? So you can understand how they may overlap and become part of the criminal justice system, and they're part of the mental health system already. So how those two worlds will end up colliding, right? And when we get in, when the different drugs that I've chosen come from different categories of drugs that are associated with addictions. And that's the opiates, which are the codeine and the painkillers. But then there's the semi-synthetic and the fully synthetic. And that makes a difference too. The ones that come just from the poppy seed, like that's the original, but then they've created, you can manufacture the semi-synthetic. Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Nice. Then there's the barbiturates, the benzos, the stimulants, like Ritalin or Adderall. It's important because those drugs are, because you're studying impulse control disorder, we're going to be talking about that as well. That's really easy to sell on the street. And whether it's a slow release or whether it's just a regular dose, the value increases if it's an SR, right? The club drugs, the dissociative drugs, when you're getting into the hallucinogens. Then I look at substances, like inhalants. I used to work when I worked at Cecil Facer. There was a lot of kids that came from Northern Ontario, like far Northern Ontario, and a lot of communities. And when they actually came, there was a lot of drug-related activity. But because they didn't have a lot of drugs, what they did was use inhalants. And so there was a lot of gasoline because there was a lot of trucks, a lot of snow machines, so that they would inhale gas, or they'd sniff glue.
That happens in Latin America a lot.
And why? Because it's so cheap. And
kids can afford it, like, can get it easy.
have you ever seen anybody who's done it for any length of time? And what happened? They're brain dead.
Yeah.
They're done. They're done. There was a kid at Pacer, I remember, it's like, oh my God. And it's he was 15. He'd sit, and until you moved him, he didn't move. It's like, this kid's life is over, like, because we are our brains. It was tragic. It was so tragic. Right? Okay. Any questions about anything in terms of what we've done so far? Okay. And I just want to put the context, now that we've been together for about 3 weeks, I think we have the whole class now. And putting some kind of context to all how I teach, or the importance of why I will refer back many times to the biopsychosocial, cultural, spiritual model of concurrent disorders. Okay. Oh, I wanted to do this thing. Last thing. That exercise had to do with this. Is anybody familiar with the Johari window? Where's my psych people? Psych people probably should know about the Johari window. And that it was developed by a psychologist, and it's a way of kind of framing information that when we walk into the field, we have 4 quadrants, right? One is information that's known to ourselves, that we choose to share, and other people, right? That you have, you've got highlights, you have brown eyes, you're so tall and whatever, right? That this is information, by looking at you, I might be able to tell perhaps what culture you might be from. I might make assumptions, but I need to clarify, right? But so there's you can look up the Johari window. So there's this information that, you know what, you're sitting with someone, pretty much, some things are very obvious. This is where clinical counseling skills are really important. Does anybody know one of the key features for FAS? How you would be able to tell if someone has FAS, yes. Right? This is your observation skills. That would be something that we would see is that there's no filter. Right? That would be something you would see that. Now, this is information, this is blind. This is known to self, but not to others. This is where we spend most of our life in the field of mental health and addictions. This is the skill of counseling. This is the skill of learning that people have their past, they have their knowledge, unless they've disassociated, which is possible as well, but they have their lived experiences, that they've had trauma, there has been physical abuse, they've lived in poverty, they've, or whatever they know, they know it, but it's not known to others. We're the other. Our job is to learn this, right? Then there's this part. This is information that's hidden to self. This is why we need feedback. This is why we have a process of other people and in relationships and having a trusted friend or a trusted confidant or a trusted counselor or somebody in our lives that will say to us, this is what I see, this is what I hear, right? And they observe or they listen and somehow are able to share their observations or their perceptions to that person, right? If you're working with someone in the field of addictions, you're basically, this is actually, you start at the contemplative state, right? The skill of something maybe not known to self. When I was working with kids in conflict with the law and they were incarcerated, Cecil Facer, my question would be to them, is this sort of what you had planned? That you were going to spend your adolescence locked up? Is this what your plan for your life was? Or did you have another idea of what you thought might be fun, right? It's kind of having them look at themselves and just say, well, what is it that you might have been engaged in that you're doing that might be keeping you in jail? So you're having them look at themselves. This is having people, teaching people how to self-reflect, right? Because they don't know what they're doing. This is why people, for anybody who's gone to counseling, people hear things that are not said. They can understand things at a different level. And you provide that information or feedback to someone. So this is the hidden to self, things you didn't know about. Actually, when you go back on your assignment, if you go back on your assignment and you actually look at what's blocking you from change, you're all supposed to be, you all have these great ideas about what you're going to be doing. I can almost 100% guarantee no one's done squat with it because you're too busy. There's too much stuff going on. There's too many demands. You've got classes, you've got assignments, you got lives, you got this, you got that going on. And but you know what? If that was really interfering with your life, you're going to have to do something about it. Because if nothing changes, nothing changes. And it keeps going on. It's the same stuff will happen. If nothing changes, nothing changes, right? Then there's this. This is the unknown. This is, it's not known to yourself, and it's not known to others. This is growth. This is when we experienced something and had no idea that we were capable of that. Other people didn't know that they were capable of that. At the smallest level, I experienced that last week. Did I ever in a million years ever think I could create a YouTube channel? Never. Was it ever on my radar? Never, right? So this is something, and then, I've got my granddaughter going, "Atta go, Maury." Maury is the Gaelic word for grandmother. And it's like, "Atta go," it's like, oh, she's proud of me kind of thing. But I didn't know that I could do that, and they didn't know I could do that either. She didn't know I was capable of that. I'm just her old grandmother kind of thing, right? Yeah, I didn't know you could learn anything new, but so that's one of those examples. Or you've gone through something. And this is when we talk about Michael Unger and resilience and people learning how incredibly resilient they are. When I've got people who've lived a history of abuse, or I've worked with people who have every reason in the world to walk with a chip on their shoulder and be angry at everything and everybody, but they're not. Like, first of all, that's their psychological makeup, that's part of it. But the other thing is that they have this resilience about them that they've gone through. There's an expression that I've heard that admire those people who walk through fire and then come out of the other end with buckets of water for those who are still in the flames. Right? And that's when you've learned things about yourself. Like, what are you incredibly proud of? You've come to a new country. My God. Like, what did you do? When did you come here?
Like a month ago,
A month.
with
Okay.
my son, that's.
Just the two of you. Uprooted from a whole other country, different climate, different language, different culture. Had to, and you just didn't come from another country. You had to register. You know what OSAP's like? Right? And then you had to register at the college, and then you had to get your son set up in school, and then has he got friends, and you worry about all these other things. You have to find a place to live. Boom, 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 and the list, and look at where you are. You came in late. Doesn't matter. You're here because your priority is your son. And you got him, and you had to make sure he was safe, and he will come before you anytime, right? Look at you. Do you even honor who you are? Do you honor what you've accomplished, even in this short period of time?
Sometimes, I mean, I try to, that's my motivation.
Good.
This was just something I wanted for a long time, and now I'm like I kind of like I take my time to actually realize what this is. I'm like, look where I am right now, which is a long process. I think it's been tough sometimes.
Okay, do you realize the wisdom you bring to your field?
Not really. I mean, a bit, but I'm not aware of that completely.
What wisdom does she bring to this field?
Living and learning how to navigate.
Yeah, you're just going down like that. That's a huge deal.
Yeah.
It is an incredible deal. You maneuvering your way through all that crap in your previous institution. Oh, yeah. No, it's not. And I think people minimize, because we're the helpers. We minimize what we bring to the field. This is how we have to honor what we bring, because it's like, why are we in this field in the first place? We feel we have something to offer. But most of us, it's because we've been through stuff, right? And we have something to give back because we've mastered. But we forget sometimes maybe how important that is, right?
In the rush of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, because we're busy and stuff like, but we don't take time and reflect. But what you bring to the field is that when you share that with someone, it's like, oh my God, it can be over. So when you're sitting with someone and they're feeling overwhelmed, you can either tell your story or you can say things in a way that's like, oh, and you got this to do and this to do and that. Why do you think I was able to say what I did to you?
Because you get it.
Yes. I was a single mom and balancing all kinds of stuff and going to school and blah, 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 and working full-time, working part-time, taking 2 courses at a time for my master's. You know, like, I mean, it's like, and you look back and go, how the hell, and you have no clue, right? But so you start, and it's because my experience was able to give that to you and honor you for that, right? And then you've done the same thing, you've traveled, you've come to, right? When did you come here?
In 26, August 26. Oh,
Just August 26th.
yeah.
We're not even a month.
No.
What the hell's the date today? Today's the 22nd? No, 21st, no.
August.
Yeah, but.
You haven't even been here a month.
No.
No. And you're here in class, and you've got your homework, you've got everything organized. You're like, that's to be honored. Like, honestly. But you know, part of it is like, we're women, we just do stuff. We just handle everything because, sorry guys, if that sounds very sexist, but you know, it is what it is. So. But this is why it's really important that we also, when we do that introspective work and we look at, and we walk from the places to honor ourselves, is to stay humble. For country music fans, always stay humble and kind, right? You a country fan? Yeah, me too. I'm a pro. Okay, so that's the context for things. Any question? Make sense? Now, what we're gonna talk about in the next few weeks is all the different diagnoses. When I was putting this course together and researching it, what I was looking at was trying to find, looking at those particular diagnoses that are more highly related or highly associated with concurrent disorders. So that's the ones that we're actually gonna be focusing on, right? The first one, though, we're gonna be talking about today is depression, but it's a huge field of study. It's a huge field of study. And whatever you get here in your field, as you continue to work in the field, please continue to research, please continue, like, I mean, if every week I'm gonna be bringing in mounds and mounds and mounds of papers, because that houses all the information, and everything gets updated all the time. Like right now, what I'm gonna share with you is something from CAMH. Now, this was published, when was this one in? No, this was the Recovery First. This is the American Addiction Center. And they actually talked about the connection between depression and substance abuse. And their position is, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, data indicates a connection between mood disorders like depression and substance abuse, with those diagnosed with the mood disorder being twice as likely to abuse substances than a person without a mood disorder. The New York Times states that 1/3 of people with depression have an alcohol problem as well, an addiction. And statistics provided by the University of Utah show that 27% of people who have major depressive disorder have a drug addiction as well. So the correlation is there. It's not automatic, right? Just because you have depression, that doesn't mean that you're going to have an addiction. But there is, you can understand, if it does exist, you can understand there is a correlation. Studies and stats have indicated that this is highly associated. And as we go through, we can understand why this might be the case, right? From the biopsychosocial perspective. The first one we're gonna, because there's so many different diagnoses. What I like to do, I'm a very visual person, and it helps with memory. Where's my eraser? I use it for, there it is. I use it for pictures, for anxiety, and for depression. And it just helps when you're actually studying as well. It's just something as simple as you draw an umbrella, right? With different spikes. This is depression. Can everybody who's watching, can you see this?
No.
Hard to see anything on the board. Okay, draw an umbrella, right? And in the top of it, put depression. And then have a bunch of spokes going down. Because there's many different kinds of depression, as are there anxieties. There's like 9 anxiety disorders. All this is from the DSM-5, right? Which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders. So when we actually look at, and we'll look at the ones that are probably are most prevalent in the field of addiction. There is, we'll go through them, MDD, and that's major depressive disorder. Okay, then there is bipolar disorder, but there's bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Okay. My cousin that I spoke about, this is what he lived with, right? With the meaning. Then there is dysthymia, or PDD, pervasive depressive disorder, otherwise known as dysthymia. There's SAD, or seasonal affective disorder. You'll learn about what that is. There is postpartum depression, right? There is depression with psychosis. There are many different forms of depression, okay? The ones that we're going to focus on that are more highly associated with, so when we use the word depression, we can't just look at this global word, right? Because depression, we're going to be talking about some of the general signs and symptoms, right? Let's just look at them. When we look at depression as a whole and we think about depression, right? It has these similar traits, but each of these have nuances, have onset nuances, have treatment nuances, and that makes a big difference, those small details, right? So overarching symptoms of someone who's feeling depressed, they will talk about aches and pains, they'll talk about sleeplessness, they'll talk about not being able to sleep, sleeping too much, feeling hopeless, feeling suicidal, feeling anxious. There's a weight gain, a weight loss. There's a loss of energy. They're tearful all the time. They have this cloud. They express this kind of weight. They will say they feel like there's an elephant on their chest, like there's this huge weight. They really want to get out of bed, but they literally can't. And then you have people, well, just do it. It's like, now there's the guilt. I should be doing this. I know this is not, I'm experiencing this, and I know I should be getting up. I know I should be doing all this stuff. So now you add all this guilt and shame on top of everything else. There's a loss of interest in hobbies or activities, but there's a loss of hanging out with friends. They're not doing the stuff that they used to do. They're not going to school. They're not going to work. Their regular life activities don't exist anymore. They can't concentrate, and they actually spend a lot of time thinking about suicide, right? Not necessarily, they think in terms of their spots. Kids, mostly adolescents and kids, 8, 9-year-old kids think like this, believe it or not. It's scary. Is that, I wonder what the world would be like if I wasn't in it. I wonder if anybody would miss me. You know, does anybody really kind of love me anyway? Like, we all have that kind of where we crash and burn sometimes, and we have that kind of like pity parties. Pity parties are helpful because when we come out of them, we realize how good it is, how good things are, but it's really important sometimes to feel low because we never know how good up feels if we don't ever feel low, right? So what's important about these signs and symptoms though, because you're gonna find major depressive is gonna have those, bipolar is gonna have those, dysthymia is gonna have those, and so seasonal affective disorder. What is significant though, and for you as a mental health professional, is to look at the antecedents, look at the start dates, look at the variables. When did it start? How did it start? Right? Yeah, and you're, like the time of onset, how long someone's experienced that. Now, this is something, if you look up, do I have it? I don't know if in the PowerPoint, do I actually have the DSM-5 diagnosis or criteria? I can't remember. Okay, why isn't this working? I'm just trying to go to that thing. Okay, so this actually, just so you know you have it in your notes, this is the DSM criteria. That is what a mental health, a doctor or a psychiatrist, these are the criteria they're going to use to say, Is someone experiencing depression? Is the depressed mood most of the day? Is there a marked diminished interest and pleasure in all or all activities? Is there significant weight loss? Like, they have their own checklist. As a therapist, we have our own diagnostic tool as well. It's a depression screening. Is there a slowing down of thought or reduction of physical movement? But they're not doing things that they used to do. Is there fatigue or loss of energy? They're gonna ask all these questions. Their feeling of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, diminished ability to think or concentrate, recurrent thought of death, recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan, right? Has there been a suicide attempt, right? Some things may not be as obvious if you're working especially with females more than other populations. You'll see their wrists, right? And if you see a lot of cutting on their wrist, right? That doesn't worry me when I see that. That doesn't worry me. It's when the cutting happens on the abdomen and the cutting happens on the inner thighs. Why?
Because you cannot see.
It's in secret, but the pain is there. And we don't even have to understand it. For the people who engage in that behavior, that is a really emotional release. And it's actually an alternative to suicide, right? It's the release of pain, it's the release of, it's that kind of, everything that's in sort of comes out kind of thing. But when it's, so if it's on the wrist, I'm not as worried. If it's on the arm, I'm far more worried when it's on the abdomen, when it's hidden. Because that's done privately and it's done secretly, and that's the other, I hate the expression, oh, you're just doing it for attention. And is there an issue? What's wrong with that? Someone is saying, I need someone to hear me. I need someone to pay attention to me about all this stuff going on. What else do I have to do? My God, what else do I have to do to get people to hear me, right? I've already dyed my hair 15 shades of green. I've already pierced everything on my body. Piercing, by the way, is the same, is like tattooing, right? Sort of. Tattooing is also looked at a way of, it's interesting. I don't know that. To receive this diagnosis, okay. Now this is interesting, is that a psychiatrist or a medical doctor would have to give this diagnosis, they have to have, the symptoms must cause the individual clinically significant distress or impairment in their social, occupational, other important areas of health. Everything's falling apart. They're not going to school, they're not being a parent, they're not going to work, they're not hanging out with their friends, everything about it is not working. Symptoms must also not be the result of substance abuse. Interesting, these are why the questions are so important. You know, when we did a genogram and we got the family history, it was also involved the medical history, whether there was diabetes, whether there was heart problems. If there's thyroid issues, thyroid problems often manifest themselves as depression, right? So if that kind of question, these kind of questions are not asked, then someone's going to be treated for something when in actual fact, this is a medical diagnosis. So little things like, they're not little things, they're huge things, but this is how you learn to think critically, and your mind thinks of all kinds of things. You'll be so amazed at your ability to think of all the different variables or components that are involved in sitting with someone and listening and storing it away. You have to store all this away. It's got to sit in your brain. I take notes, by the way, but. Yeah.
My friend had, she had a kid, her kid is 9 now.
Yeah.
And at the time she got into depression, but nobody really, she didn't want to breastfeed. She was not into the kid and at all, nothing. Yeah. And 9 years after that, they found that she had cancer. So she got removed the thing. Now she went through a treatment and everything, but it happened, and we didn't know. I was okay, let's go, and I kind of helped her with the kid, but I could see that she struggled. She didn't want to get out of bed, she didn't want to work. So it was a very hard time, and after 9 years, she had that problem. She was diagnosed, and they did the whole thing, and
but they weren't looking for it. They probably thought it was depression right off the bat, or
exactly.
Thought it was postpartum depression.
They thought that, yeah.
But see, this is the thing in our field, being a critical thinker. That's nobody will tell you to do that. I never told anybody what to write on that first assignment. They put as much thought, as much depth, as much work into it as they chose to do it. I didn't tell anybody to do that, right? They did it. And it's the same thing. You as a professional, you will determine how much work, how much energy, how much time you will invest. Because you know what? Whether you do all that work and get paid $100 an hour or get paid $100 an hour and do a half-ass job, you're still gonna get paid the same amount. And there's people who do that all the time. You get paid a certain amount of money, whether you do it with passion or don't do it with passion, you're getting the same amount of money. It's just more tiring when you do it with passion. And that's basically your own work ethic. Nobody can tell you what to do. Like, you have to make that decision. I am going to hopefully highly influence you to do with the other, because I can't see it doing any other way when you're in the human, when you're in what I call a sacred space. When you are with someone, that you're sitting with someone and they trust you, that's sacred space, right? And that needs to be honored. But that's my thought. But it's interesting how that critical thinking is involved. And I've learned a lot from my daughter. Like, my daughter is a doctor of naturopathic medicine. And so when she teaches me so many things, like a lot of women who are on birth control, right? They come in and they're having depressive symptoms and they're having all this kind of stuff. Then she starts looking at and doing the blood work and starts doing the investigation. And it's like looking at what birth control pill they're on. And then like, there was a woman many, many years ago that I worked with that was a police officer, and she actually her gun was taken away from her because she was exhibiting signs of depression. When in actual fact, she was put on, what the hell was that? Oh my God. I forgot the name of it, where you don't have your period like for 2 years. What's the name of that one? I can't remember.
But I know.
You know,
Yeah.
anyway, so what happened is your body is like tricked itself into thinking it's pregnant for 2 years. You know what that did to her body? What it did to her estrogen and progesterone, and it ended up creating depression symptoms, when in actual fact it was her body that was playing tricks with her. And this is a lot of work. That's funny because my daughter works a lot within women's health and understanding the female body and how different it is. And then you also are tracing, a lot of times I'll trace, I saw a kid last night. I work, I have a private practice, so I saw someone last night. She's 16 years old. And I've known her for a little bit, and this is when you get to know people, right? And she's sitting there and she's crying, and then she's having this hard time, and it's about relationships and this kind of amazing, really bright, intuitive. Most of the kids that I end up seeing, the adolescents or young people I end up seeing, the reason they come in is because they're so bright, because they're emotionally intelligent, and they struggle not being different than other people because they're just wiser and smarter and more intuitive. I don't know. Anyway, so I said, hang on for a second. Let me check the last few times I saw you. Sure enough, same time of the month. It was the same time of the month. And I thought, I don't even know why I thought about that. I was like, oh my God, okay, hang on. Let me go check. Yeah, because I have to do notes every time you see someone and you have to record it. And sure enough, it was like, oh, yeah, we're in around the 20th to the 24th kind of thing. It's like, oh my God. And that's why it's really like, so it would look like she is really depressed, but in actual fact, her body is just, she's going like, what do we call it, batshit crazy, the psycho bitch kind of stuff that goes on there. And it has some, and it's her body. It's not her, but I mean, it is her body doing all this kind of crazy ass stuff with her kind of thing. It's the same thing, and this is why we understand things like ADHD. And that's a medical condition, it's not a behavioral condition, and that actually manifests itself in these behaviors. And that how people, it's our body and our brain playing tricks on us. And it's manifesting like this, and it's like, there's nothing wrong with you, you have a medical condition that we need to treat. So, there goes my squirrel moments. I have lots of those, I'll deliver it, but somehow it'll make sense, hopefully. You even have this chart, right? So it's in your notes kind of thing. So you may have, this is what it's gonna look like. So you need to understand that. Now, these are additional symptoms, right? That may not be in the DSM-5, but you see them, right? oversensitivity and preoccupation with self, the negative thinking. It's like you are in such a rut. You cannot get, it's like you're treading, like you're like a hamster on a wheel, that you can't have a positive thought if your life depended on it. And you struggle to think positively, you can't get out of your own head, right? Is a little response to reassurance and support. It's like no matter what anybody says, yeah. This is a lot of, and you'll know when you take the TTM, when you study TTM, is that this is yeah, but. As soon as you hear the yeah, but, is they're stuck, right? Either they're, I'm not interested, I like this way I'm living, or I'm so stuck I don't know, it's yeah, but. Less awareness of the feelings of others, just because they're so wrapped up in themselves. They don't care what anybody else wants. And when they say, well, don't you see what you're doing to your kids? Like, you're not taking care of them. Can't, like, and they can't, right? Feeling a need to control relationships, inability to function. So now this is the thing, this can happen to anybody. No one is immune from this experience. Most struggle with symptoms for an extended period of time. They must have undergone several stressful events, tried to manage their mood fluctuations in all relationships. Occurrence of depression may only be one or a history of least of other situations that's happened in their life. So what happens is that when they have this diagnosis, when it comes to major depressive disorder, for a doctor to diagnose this, those symptoms I just talked about had to have existed for at least 2 weeks. It's a crash and burn, right? Now, that can happen with life events. If your life partner was killed in a car accident, you're crashing and burning. If there's been a significant loss of someone that you love, you could crash and burn. If things that you had in your life, people go through that when their kids move away and there's empty nest syndrome and they don't understand what's going on or whatever. There could be life events that could be contributing, right? And sometimes you don't necessarily have to go on an antidepressant. Sometimes it's counseling. I love when doctors will refer to me and they won't put someone on an antidepressant unless they go for counseling. Because then you're familiar with CBT, because you could change the chemistry in the brain, but unless you change the thought process as well, because people don't stay on antidepressants their entire life, nor should they. Some can, right, depending, but for even a major depressive disorder, usually there's chronic depression, so people may be on antidepressants for most of their life, but there could be short-term, which is up to 2 years, right? That's when most people, people would be put on a course of antidepressants for a period of 2 years to see if the symptoms, and then with counseling and stuff like that, does the symptoms, does the mood, does the activity, do all the areas in their life start to see some improvement in that 2 years with a combination of medication and counseling, right? If it doesn't, well, there's lots of trials now that what they're doing is they're throwing a lot of antipsychotics in, like Abilify, and they're adding a lot of antipsychotic medications in with the antidepressants. You'll see that if you watch American TV, because they love to advertise all kinds of drugs, a lot of money in it. So what happens is that there could be almost like a sudden onset, right? Where you would have these symptoms for a doctor to diagnose it, they have to exist for almost 2 weeks, right? And then the course of treatment for someone with a MD, major depressive disorder, would be a course of antidepressants. Now, it's really important to understand how many different classes of antidepressants there are, right? And how all of them work differently on the brain. Right? Most of what you're going to hear, the ones that you hear advertised, are the SSRIs. Those are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's a very specific kind of neurological activity that goes on. We're not gonna get into all that. I don't know if you're gonna be taking pharmacology. I don't know if that's part of your course. But it's important to know if someone is, or are they taking SNRI, because that's a different medications would be like Prozac, Paxil, these kinds of these ones are SSRIs, they get prescribed first, right, as a rule. And then if these are not effective, then it may be that it's not serotonin, maybe it's norepinephrine that they're having to work with, because these medications work on dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. They work on these different neurotransmitters. And if it's norepinephrine that they're requiring, depending on the symptoms, then the doctor may prescribe an SNRI, which is a different class. What is important for you as a mental health professional is if someone has been prescribed a medication, because they usually titrate them. They usually start on the lowest dose and then increase and increase, is that you are familiar with the drug and do your own homework. Because there's a lot of counterindications, especially if you're working with someone who's like 17, because whether Health Canada says kids under 18 should never be prescribed antidepressants, I can tell you that happens all the time. I know you can go into a clinic and say you have anxiety or depression and you can get an antidepressant. Yes, it's kind of scary, but there's not a lot of family doctors. And doctors are doing, like, they're trying to relieve suffering, that's their job, right? And they see someone is chronically in pain. And not everybody can afford a counselor. You know how much they charge an hour? Lots. Especially if they're private. And if you're waiting for Compass, you're waiting a year if you're under the age of 18. And unless, the other is if you're 18 and over, it's the mood and anxiety disorder clinic here in town. And then so you have to go on a waiting list and you have to, it's group therapy, it's not individual therapy. So I mean, when you know how systems work, you can understand that as much as we say we need to take care of people, well, we don't have the systems to take care of them, right? But for you to understand what medication that person's on, because there's a lot of counterindications. And if someone you're working with is just started on an antidepressant, you know what you have to be careful of? Suicidal ideation. For the first 3 to 6 weeks, when someone starts on an antidepressant, there is a lot of suicidal ideation. That's a pretty typical side effect. So people are, now this sounds weird because this is supposed to help you and not, you know, you're not be so depressed, but that's not what happens initially when someone goes on an antidepressant. There is more suicidal thought, there is more suicidal ideation, that's just one of the side effects. The other thing that ends up happening with antidepressants, and it's important, you know, because it's going to affect people's sex lives, right? So all of a sudden, their mood might be better, but their relationship's falling apart because there is no intimacy anymore in relationships because it basically has taken, it's nulled the sex drive. It numbs you, right? That's the point, right? And the other thing is important to know is that there's weight gain, especially with antipsychotics, huge weight gain, 40, 60 pounds in 30 days on an antipsychotic. Someone had issues before in terms of self-esteem. Guess what happens after being on a course of an antipsychotic in a very short period of time? But antidepressants also will result in weight gain. And people went, well, why am I putting on weight? Oh, and then they start beating themselves up. Interesting enough that this, when we get to that, carbohydrates, you know what carbohydrates do? Naturally? What do carbohydrates do naturally? And it also increases serotonin. Naturally increases serotonin, right? And this is why you'll see people crave, people with seasonal affective disorder will crave carbs, but then it ends up with weight gain. And then they don't have the exercise, they don't have the wherewithal to exercise because you just don't. You see what a vicious circle it is. And it's when we understand this and you have this body of knowledge that when someone goes on this medication, that there's things that you do proactively because you know possibly what's going to happen and you build into someone's treatment plan if they can, in terms of diet, in terms of exercise. Those things just aren't, those are very real things. Because what happens when you exercise, you increase your body's endorphins, and just create a healthier environment, right? So, does all this stuff make sense? It's overwhelming information. What time is it?
9:47.
Time for a break. Okay, so we'll take 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The shorter the break, the earlier the class. There's no place to go, right? I know. Oh, stop recording. Somebody help me to remember to start. I think that's so exciting. Wow, you traveled a lot. Okay, so the first one that we're looking at is major depressive disorder that could have an onset. It could be, you would have these symptoms for at least 2 weeks. I don't know why this isn't working. I'm cranky. Swap those things. Okay, so the next one we're going to be looking at is bipolar disorder, and there's the two. Okay, bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression, or it can be. I mean, there's the two names, they're kind of interchanged. But bipolar 1 is when people will experience depression, right? Where they'll have these major depressive episodes, but then what they will do is they will have something called a manic episode or mania. And this will be different for different people, right? Mania can be agitation, it can be walking for days at a time, it could be maxing out your credit card, it could be hypervigilance, it could be aggression. It depends on the individual. And in bipolar 1, the cycling between depression and mania, it differs for every person. They can cycle within minutes, it could be every second day, it could be every 2 weeks, it could be every couple of months. It really depends. You really have to get to know the individual. But what happens, there's this one person that I knew, she was 18 years of age, and she was diagnosed. No one could really kind of understand what she was experiencing, because she would be very depressed, and then she would have this hyperactivity kind of thing and just going, and like it's almost like it was ADHD, it was all over the map, and no one could understand what was going on. She didn't understand what was going on, but the mom was very wise. And she ended up having her assessed. Now, she ended up being diagnosed with bipolar 1, but in her manic stage, she was so aggressive. The mom ended up calling the OPP, Ontario Provincial Police, to come and they joked and they said, she's 18 years old, she weighs about 110 pounds soaking wet, who can't control this little kid? Well, they got this girl at 18, 110 pounds soaking wet, took down a 300-pound officer. It was this thing, she was in her manic phase, was so strong, right? Now I ended up being treated and how doctors might know that it's bipolar depression versus just depression, they begin treating them with an antidepressant, but there would be these signs and symptoms, basically, that they're not having a good response to 3 or more antidepressants. So what happens, people may be, if they have depression, like a major depressive disorder, they'll go on one antidepressant. If that's not working, they have to go off it. See, that's the thing with medication, with antidepressants. You have to be off them for a period of 6 weeks before you can go on another one. So in that 6 weeks, you've got to be very careful in watching the individual. So, and then they'll try another one, because maybe people's individual chemistry doesn't work with them. right? So they'll try, but there'll have to be at least 3 different types of medications or antidepressants, and they weren't working. Or they may have a hypomania or a manic episode in response to the antidepressant, that it causes the manic episode. There's a pattern of good response to, if it starts being effective and then the antidepressant is no longer effective, then the alarm bells start going off. And if there's an acceleration of mood swings in response to the antidepressant. So when you think about it, being a physician or being a psychiatrist and having to tweak out all this information and having to get all this information and understanding all this stuff is it's a lot of work. And then you just think about the reality of our own hip system. And you appreciate that most doctors only can sit with someone for 10 minutes. And the way the billing goes is you only can talk about one thing, and then you have to make another appointment. Does it make sense to people? Are you familiar with this process? And so how this kind of goes is that in just the way the system is kind of set up, it's not really conducive to someone to sit there and talk about all the stuff that's going on in their life and how they're responding to things. Like everybody's doing the best they can with what they have, but the medical system and the diagnostic system really, and even psychiatrists, like there's so few of them in Sudbury that they only have so much time to sit and talk, and they're having to type notes, they're maximizing their time, so you're sitting there, I don't know if anybody's ever seen a psychiatrist, but you're actually sitting there and you're talking to them and they're typing the whole time because they're doing the notes while they're talking to you. Because they have to move on to the next one because there's so much work to be done, there's so few of them. So when you think about it, your job as an advocate, as a mental health professional, is that the more information you can garnish, the more information you can gather, and then you act as an advocate, because one of the treatment issues, one of the things you may be doing is going with the person you're working with to their doctor's appointment, or if they allow you, right? If you sign a release of information or Form 14 and you can actually, you're given permission to sit with them, is that you can maybe do that, right? And then you can provide this copious amount of information in a very compressed period of time, whereas someone experiencing depression or having a manic episode is not able to express those things. And they're not getting the background, they're not getting all the history or any of the contributing factors that may be really relevant. When I used to work with kids in conflict with the law, I would do all the work for the lawyer. So that when I went to youth court, or I would go to B court with the adults, is that I would have all this information, I have all the background information, I give it to defense counsel so that they can then represent their client, but they don't have all that time to do that, right? So it takes on a different kind as an advocate, because I believe that's what we are, is that when we're in the field, we are advocating on behalf of people who don't yet have their voice. They're suffering. They don't have a voice, they're suffering, right? Okay, so that would be the next kind of depressive disorder with bipolar. Now what happens in bipolar 2 is that the mania is simply just not as extreme. It isn't as, it's more complicated than that, but but when you think about this, when someone is going through depression, when someone is feeling so crappy, and then someone says, take this medication, and the symptoms start going away, that you don't feel this way anymore. And then after a couple of years, they start the business of titrating or cutting down on the medication, saying, you know what, we're going to take you from 100 to, and everything's different because depending on the company, depending on the manufacturer, different dosages make a difference. So you're going to go from 50 or from 75 to 50 to 25 now, and people become terrified. There may not be the physical dependence, but this is one of those situations where you may end up at psychological dependence. What's going to happen if they have not learned alternative coping mechanisms? If they haven't had that ability, if their life situation hasn't changed, if they're still living in poverty, if they still don't have a job, if nothing else has happened in their life, when we look at those social determinants of health, and all of that is the same, what do you think their chances of being successful off that medication are going to be? Probably really slim, right? But they need the medication. So what are they gonna do? They will find the medication, where they need to find the medication. Because it's like they can't, they've learned physically maybe to cope with it, but it's more psychologically, because nothing else has changed in their life. This is why you study the biopsychosocial model. This is why you study the social part of their lives, why you have to come up with a treatment plan that reflects changes in their existence. That's why we study Maslow. You cannot do effective treatment with someone going from where they are to where they want to be if you don't look at Maslow in the first two levels. That if they're still living on the streets and they're still hell-bent on meeting their physiological needs and their safety and security needs, they're not interested in coming off any medication. They're interested in survival, right? This is why this stuff is all important, that when we talk of all these things, it's about the treatment. Everything is about what am I gonna do? Yeah.
So, like, yeah, talking about bipolar disorder, like, I have a story. So,
Yep.
My best friend that used to be my neighbor, I was at her house like almost like every day of the week, like when I was a kid, and come to find out now that her mom was bipolar disorder, and also her mom and her dad were both alcoholics. But I was there every day. Never did I know, because as a kid you don't notice, but now looking back, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. But like, I remember my friend always being like, oh, my parents are like broke, and I'm like, what? Like, his mom would always be coming home with like a new iPad, or like she had a house decorator and this and that, and then I was like, what the heck? But also like they're moved out now. But at one point, like her dad said that he's getting clean and blah blah blah. But our new neighbors were like, oh, like you were friends with the girls, eh? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, oh, we found some of the alcohol that they did downstairs, like in the laundry like group. And I was like, no, I was, and I'm like, there was so much stuff that happened, and it just makes so much sense now. As a kid, you don't realize.
No, you don't realize. But then the alcohol, that makes sense, right? When you are depressed. See, this is why when we do the genogram, a history of alcoholism, actually, when you look at it, is probably more a history of depression. Because even up until, what, 80s, 90s, people didn't talk about mental health issues. Certain cultures, my God, you don't ever talk about having mental health issues. Your family is disgraced, you're disgraced. It's not something, because it's seen as some character deficit as opposed to a medical condition, right? And so it's kind of shunned on. But when you look back, because in my family there's a whole just alcoholism everywhere kind of thing, but you wonder if that wasn't just a coping mechanism, right? Because you know what do you do when you go to a bar? What do people do? They party before they go to party, because they want to relax. They want to just, their inhibitions go down. They just feel more comfortable, right? It's just, this is how we take care of anxiety, we take care of self-esteem issues, is that we become less inhibited. But the alcohol does that. And we don't feel pain, right? When you think about, if you're living on the streets and it's a cold night and you're freezing, if you're drunk, you don't feel any of that stuff. So how else are you gonna handle it? Who gets to judge that, right? That's not what somebody chooses, for God's sake. That's not the life they want. But that's the one they have, and they don't know how to get out of it. If they did, they'd be out of it. If you guys thought you could change the behaviors, you did, but you didn't do it yet. So you're no different. We're no different. Neither am I. But interesting with bipolar is that that's one of the ones where there's a really strong genetic link. When you talk about, when we talk about those crosses, that cross, that's my cousin's son. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and then my son and my cousin and his son had schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, right? But because he was a drug user, and Sudbury doesn't have a current integrated system of treatment, you either go for the drug treatment or you go to the mental health treatment, but they're not treated at the same time, is that there's very few places that actually do that, because it's a funding side of the thing, but there was that strong genetic link. And if the other thing with some diagnoses like bipolar, schizophrenia, those are adult diagnoses. So people can't be diagnosed with them until they're 18. That would be not fun, right? So I mean, but those symptoms were there at 14, 15, 16, 17. So how does someone mask those? How does someone deal with those? This is how it all kinds of makes sense. It's not judgment, it makes sense. Okay, so there's bipolar disorder. Highly related because you're feeling all these symptoms, and thank you for the example, because they were experiencing this mania. Now, the mania was the purchasing of things. Is that what they found out, is that they maxed out credit
What I
cards?
found was that the biggest one was just always buying, and then she'd go down early. And then a few months later, again, like just buying, and then.
That was her mania. And that's what happens with people who looks, and COVID made it perfect, right? Everybody's got like where you're ordering everything, and it's like the best job in the world is to be an Amazon driver, right? Because people made a fortune. How many people saw things delivered to people's houses all for 2 years during COVID? Because that's, right? And that's tailor-made for someone. That would be an example. My ex-husband, his sister had bipolar, and she used to walk, like she would walk for 3 days and not stop. It's not physiological, you don't think it's possible, but she did in her manic state, would walk for 3 days. Right? Yeah, and it would be different for each individual. So that's when we hear every individual story. But
She's saying Forrest Gump, as the movie, like he runs for days and days and days.
oh yeah, Forrest Gump, yeah. Yes.
Someone can be diagnosed with more than one.
That's right. Absolutely. Because you can have major depressive disorder, you can have bipolar, you can have a lot of depression with psychosis too, when you've got the hallucinations and stuff. The other one that's an interesting one is dysthymia, or pervasive depressive disorder, right? And this is where, this is more insidious. This kind of depression is insidious because it's there. I describe it as, whereas major depressive disorder, like it seems like there's an event and someone, boom, can crash, right? But what happens with dysthymia, it's almost like a low-grade fever. Major depressive disorder would be like you get a really bad infection, and you feel okay when you go to bed, then all of a sudden your fever spikes and you're sweating. I like to use sort of an example like that. Whereas dysthymia is like you've got this low-grade fever. You feel good some days, you don't feel good others. It's not bad, and so it's like a wave. It's not like big crashing waves. It's just like a wave, and you feel good, but you never like feel great. Everything's kind of mediocre. And it's sort of like a low-grade fever and people will have this usually probably for about 2 years. These symptoms will exist for 2 years before someone can actually diagnose it, right? Because you have to see that pattern, and someone would have to know someone well enough. But it's just like, like it just sort of walk around. And if you got something, if you can take some substance that just makes you feel a little bit more joyful, it kind of makes sense. Like it's not a judgment thing, it just makes sense. Like you just don't feel crappy for a while, kind of thing. But it's not, it's just like a pervasive kind of low mood. And not a lot of joy is found, right? And then when you go on an antidepressant, or if it's effective, depending if it's the right one, it's interesting to see what happens where people experience, because I've worked with people who've gone on antidepressants, and then I'll see them appearing. There's no point doing any work. When someone is really depressed, you can't do the clinical work that you need to do. You can't be engaging in CBT. It's the same thing that happens when someone is really, really highly anxious, that sometimes medication is required so that they can calm their bodies down and calm their brains down so you can do the work that you need to do. But with if people believe, whether it's genetic, whether it actually happens, or what people believe, they don't see, there's no light that goes on where they go, oh, I just feel great today. No, everything is really slow and insidious in terms of the affect changes, where they just feel like they have more energy or whatever. Okay, then there's a different one called seasonal affective disorder. It's an interesting one because it only exists 6 months of the year or 5 months of the year. It's a seasonal depression. And it's a legitimate one. I believe that I've known people who have this, is that and it has to do with the seasons. It has to do with people will start feeling this in, say, September, October, as the days get shorter, as it gets darker earlier, as there's less sunlight, as there's less vitamin D, vitamin C, less the natural things that you normally would do. And then come the spring, people start like they're back to themselves again, kind of thing. And the interesting thing about this particular diagnosis is that you have to know someone well enough in order for that diagnosis to occur. Because that has to exist. Okay. Let me just see, I can read more. The thought has to do mostly about levels of serotonin. The neurotransmitters involved in seasonal affective disorder are serotonin, dopamine, cortisol, norepinephrine. I'll just read from this too. The seasonal affective disorder emerges in particular seasons of the year. It starts in the fall, increasing during the winter months, but it disappearing in the spring. These are the signs and symptoms. Like, you're going to get the overarching signs of depression, but you're also might feel, what's different with this one is the heaviness in the arms and the legs, and a craving for carbohydrates. This is where we talked about that earlier. And this is why you will see a weight gain for people during this period of time, because the carbs increase the production of serotonin in the brain, right? And so without even realizing that, and so when people are depressed, then when they start eating more carbs, they don't even know what they're doing, is they're setting off this neurological chain of reaction, which increases the level of the feel good, increase the level of serotonin. The other thing that happens with depression, and with this particular one, because it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, is a lot of relationship issues. And a lot of relationship issues happen with all of these depressive disorders, because people's moods are so low and they're so self-absorbed, or it looks like they're self-absorbed, that, and even if they go on medication, the medication kills the libido, and you're just, now what happens, even on antidepressants, is that what it does, you don't feel the lows, but you don't feel the highs either, right? So you're just level kind of thing. That is not, so you don't get all these, la joie de vivre, for those who's French here, then this excitement for life kind of thing, if you don't have it. It's just like you're just kind of existing, but it's better than feeling awful all the time. Now, what's really important is when you're working with people in the field that are experiencing depression, don't forget they're part of a network, their parents or their partners. It's as important in the microsystem, because the mesosystem is the relationship between people in the microsystem. Remember when we studied Rothenberger? Is that part of your treatment plan is informing people in their microsystem about what this person might be experiencing, because you're looking for supports. That's why you do a genogram. If you're looking for supports in the family, that someone, if there's a genetic link, if there's someone that can help us understand. If you're looking at manic depression and you're helping someone understand, this is a genetic, you inherited this. It's like ADHD. There's a strong genetic link with it. Let's look at your parents. So instead of beating yourself up for this, let's look at the genetics that contributed. And that's that saying that I talked about last week. Genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. It's not an automatic, but it helps understand if someone that is sort of sitting there. So I think, I don't know how accurate this is, because I'm not, do I have medical professionals here? Are you medical professionals? Okay. That is, I've heard the cancer cells sit in everybody, right? And depending on what stimulus or happens, that they can emerge, or they can is that, you've heard that, have you heard that, or do you know that to be true, like?
I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Everybody have cancer cells.
Yeah. And whether the environment kind of sparks that, you know, if someone has a predisposition and doesn't smoke, or someone has a predisposition and smokes, you're just setting the chances of developing something probably through the roof, right? So if, I don't know exactly, like I'm out of my realm when it comes to that, but but when we look at these, when we help someone understand, especially if they have like an impulse control disorder, is that you want to take a look at your mom or dad, because if you got it, one of them have it, and then you go, oh yeah. See, it's not you, like you're not a problem. You are not a problem. Too often the people that we work with think they're the problem as opposed to they have a problem. Big difference between those two ways of approaching and thinking things, right? Yeah.
I realized that my grandma, from my dad's side, because they were during like the start of the guerrilla and all of that in Colombia, just realizing, because knowing about what's happening before in my family, because my dad has Alzheimer's, but for me, he got into kind of like a depression, because it was sometimes like he was off completely, like he was just looking through the window, like, well, anyway, so going back to his history in his life and all of the things that happened, my mom told me that he left, I mean, my grandma sent all of the kids kind of to save them, they sent them to different houses, like family, but like she has to just move them around and let them for be safe. So, and there was my aunt was telling me about this, like, when something happened, she just didn't do anything. And I was like, what did she do the whole day? She was like, sometimes she was just in bed, like she didn't want to like do anything, like she didn't want to get her kids, like she was just like doing nothing, like in this, you know. And of course, my grandma, she died like 10 years ago, and she was 96, so it's not a time for that. And I think she was into some kind of depression because she couldn't do anything. And I mean, I'm a mom, I understand that when you gotta do this, you gotta do it. But like if you don't have the, you know, into it, I'm just not gonna do it. And I realized what happened, and then I can see that my dad goes in kind of the same direction. Like he goes and he just looks at the window. Like, and then if you ask, because he's 81 now, so he doesn't go with this. He doesn't know about them. He doesn't really. So he's like, no, I'm okay. Everything is okay. No, it's
Everything's
not.
okay, because you don't talk about this stuff,
Exactly.
you're trained not to talk about it.
So that's what I realized. I mean, I think my family would have that depression kind of being around, but
But you see whether it's a genetic thing or a circumstantial thing. And I think just going back, let's look at, say, the 60s scoop and what happened, right? And you look at communities, all these children being taken from their community. I could not even imagine that if, as a mom, that I have my kids here one day and then they're gone. And I don't know when, if I'm gonna see them, where are they? What happens to your very existence about who you are and all of it? Just think about it. Like, I mean, could you imagine, do you have kids in your life and you don't see them again? What are you gonna do? Like, how do you respond to that? And the depression that sets in and the coping mechanisms that sets in. And by the way, alcohol was a part of the life, it was brought in. It wasn't a way of life, right? And then then you just think, what do you do? And then you start thinking in terms of you understand more about what the Canadian government did in terms of making sure that you annihilate an entire culture, because what you do is you take them off the land, you stick them in the place where there's no resources, where there's all the traditional way of living doesn't exist anymore. And it's like, who you are as a person, how you identify yourself is gone, right? So when we think about these when we think about depression and we go back to people's history and we look at events that happen, that we understand, we don't judge, we understand, we place it within some kind of context. And was that, what happens, what, from the neurology of it, was that that would be called clinical depression. And so we give it a name. But what other name would we give it if we didn't call it clinical depression? That's pain. That's suffering.
Yeah.
What else do you call that stuff? We can call it depression, but when people lose, when there's been miscarriages or losses of children or deaths of significant, especially children, like what happens to people? It's like the loss is incredible. Sure, we can call it depression, but it's.
I was gonna say, like in my culture, they started using intergenerational trauma as like, I guess, depression. In a way, like, just looking back at the history.
Yes.
I know it's not like in the educational systems, but I know
I taught it.
a lot of people use that term just because, like, I grew up with depression. My mom
Yes.
has chronic depression
Yeah.
and PTSD, and that's from her upbringing.
Yes.
And I see the way like the social determinants of health relates to all this because like, I was up reserve, I grew up there.
Yep.
And I left. Like I was one of her 4 kids who left.
Yep.
And started pursuing education.
Yeah.
Higher education.
Yeah.
And like I was angry at her for the longest time because she gave me and my sister up
Yeah.
to CAS because she had depression. She couldn't raise us.
That's right.
Yeah.
But we still lived on the same reserve,
Yeah.
so I was able to still like live
Yeah.
after a while.
Yeah.
And yeah, just like realizing that as I got older, like understanding why she was the way she was, like the depression, it wasn't on purpose. And it was just like her story of like not having that love because my grandma went to residential school and how was she supposed to raise her children to be loving and like,
Yes.
all these things that we're supposed to be to our kids. And now that I have a little one, I'm like, I'm never gonna like do everything in my power to not like do that, or be that way. And yeah, I was angry at my mom for the longest time, but when I left and started learning about all these issues, underlining issues, I like forgave her, and now I'm just trying to like help her. And,
So now we can have compassion. And I think that's different than sympathy, Chini Bunch. That's compassion but you get it, and just, so when you're talking about working with people who don't have your ability to sit back and go, now I get it. So you're walking with trauma, you're walking with anger, you're walking with trauma. Screw you, and then, so you end up doing things, and it's only, so that's an important thing to know, that when you're working with people on the journey to recovery, they don't necessarily always stay there, right? That it's not gonna be at your speed, it's gonna be when they're ready, and as they're, I think of things as mental health professionals, as they grow, I see them sort of like as eagles. Because what happens is that, like, when you're walking, I remember I was gifted a turkey feather one time, and from someone, and the reason the turkey feather was gifted was as a reminder to always stay humble, because that's the bird that is closest to the ground. You gotta stay attached to the ground, right? But I was also gifted with an eagle feather. And so I remember, I see things as that, as professionals, we sort of walk and we're just starting down here, but as we mature, it's like we learn to soar, and we see things from a different perspective.
Right.
It's like now when we're looking at things, it's like it's not from a judgment, it's like, oh. And the light starts going on, and the level of understanding, the level of compassion develops. And it's sort of this distancing that we can have from, the further we can get from the situation, we can still have compassion, but we're not in it. So we can have that professional distancing, but at the same time, getting it and understanding it with compassion. So it's so important. Chimabunch. Okay. Because that wasn't easy to do. And then, now we understand, when we understand depression, we understand how, that we don't judge it. People have it, they experience it, and if they tell you, they're telling you their truth. Do not dilute it. It's like, well, it's not that bad. Yeah, it is. For that person, it is that bad. And listening, and it's the same thing for anybody who's ever given birth. Right? Some people scream through the entire thing, and others don't say a word. And it depends on your perspective on things. I remember thinking, oh my God, every contraction was, I get to meet this person I've been carrying for 9 months. So you're summoning your endorphins and you're doing that kind of, but I mean, I remember being beside women, it's like really having to go at it kind of thing. But it depends, right? But it's the same situation. We're both going through childbirth, but how we experience it, our mental state, our emotional state, and a whole bunch of other things, it's our reality. So we don't have a right to say, it's not that bad. Yeah, for that person, it may be that bad, right? And this is your skill as a clinician, your skill as a mental health professional, right? Okay, jump ahead. Okay, I'm gonna go back here. Mania, when we get into the treatment of bipolar disorder, one thing I should have done here, these are the medications that are used for the manic phase. Now, lithium is a drug of choice that they use for bipolar disorder. If you see someone on lithium, these, by the way, are all antipsychotics. These are very powerful, right? There's the typical and the atypical. These are the atypical antipsychotics. These are the new ones. And these are the ones that are going to end up with people having rapid weight gain. And they will use these as an adjunct to an antidepressant. And I've had different people speak about different experiences with these, right? The other thing that they do, they still do it. They don't do the old ECT. The old ECT was something else, because I used to see that. But they do ECT, electroconvulsive therapy now, but it's far tamer and it's not as traumatic for the person who goes through it.
They still do it?
Yes, but in a very different way. They don't do it the way it used to be.
Restraining. Like restraining. They used to restrain during the ECT.
I know, I saw it. Because at the Central Goma Hospital, when I used to work there, people from the 3rd floor with depression used to go up to the 5th floor and have ECT, and they would be restrained. They would have to have something in their mouth so that they wouldn't bite their tongue, because they would put electrodes on their head and they would actually send them into convulsions, not knowing quite what it did, except that it kills short-term memory. But they were like zombies. It's almost like when you see people who have one flew over the cuckoo's nest, that kind of thing, like how they used to treat things like with frontal lobotomies and stuff like that. Thank God the world's changed from the 70s and 80s, and that we know more stuff, because this is how they used to treat people. But they do some ECT, but it's a milder form, where they do, because there's a lot more studying that's being done, especially when it comes to not just depression, but psychosis, is that what part of the brain, the D2, the D1, D2, D3 receptors, way beyond me. Like, I pay homage to the people who have that kind of brain and understand how the brain works. But the research is now understanding that they can target areas of the brain that can stimulate the production of certain neurotransmitters. But someone much wiser than me that did that. So this is another depression is postpartum, and that could follow the birth of a child. And see, it's interesting what you said. It would be automatic that someone would have thought it was postpartum depression. And why that becomes significant and why we learn about that, if we find out that we're working with someone and their parent had postpartum depression, the mom had postpartum depression, what happens is that bonding that happens, the attachment that happens after birth, if that doesn't happen because the mom can't, it's not she doesn't want to, she cannot.
And they suffer, it's horrible.
Yes.
Because society just tells you how to do things as a mom, and when you can consciously not do that, it's a lot of embarrassment and shame and pain.
Because there's a level of awareness at the same time that I'm not doing it and I should be doing it. This is why a lot of depression is based in guilt.
Right.
is the word should, I'd love to take that damn word out of the dictionary, is that I should be doing this, I should be doing that. And that puts all that pressure on, instead of understanding why this is not happening. Now, in postpartum depression, that like the onset may be related to biochemical and hormonal changes. 10% of women experience this type of, that's a lot of women after childbirth, right? So, I mean, we may work with women who have depression after childbirth, because you're gonna work with women on the street. You may work with prostitutes, right? Who knows, right? Who may have raised kids. Some of the videos that you guys are going to locate for your final presentation will be, I hopefully I'll see some of them, is that interviews with women who are prostitutes and have had kids and have lost into systems or that kind of thing. And it's like, this is an understanding the guilt that they carry and how they have to get rid of the guilt. And how they get rid of the guilt is by the continual use of substances. It's like this. It's not rocket science, but it takes a great deal of compassion and understanding of all the variables that could be involved, right? Major symptoms of depression must be present for 4 weeks or more and affect the mom's social effect. So for 4 weeks, mom's experiencing this stuff for 4 weeks before she gets to go in and see her doctor, and he'll diagnose her with postpartum and start treating her. Now, where this comes into play is if mom's breastfeeding and what the side effects of the antidepressant and whether, so there's always these kinds of battles that are fought in someone's head too. Depression with psychosis, it could be so severe that people end up with psychosis. Psychosis is basically a loss of touch with reality. And we'll be talking about that as a separate diagnosis altogether. But this is, as you were saying, that many things can happen. You can have more than one mental health diagnosis at the time. So you could have depression, but you could also have psychosis. And this is where people are actually seeing things and hearing things. You know that story that I told you about that girl when we did the timeline where she was dancing on her father's feet and their father, she was having psychosis. I told you about that the person that I worked with. Didn't I tell you that last week? When we did the timeline?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, as her last memory of her father was dancing on his feet, and then the next morning he's not there, right? He had died. But she didn't know, and it's that perspective, she didn't know that her dad had cancer. You don't tell a 6-year-old your dad has cancer, right? But she carried this whole time until she's 18, that she in actual fact was the cause of that. And then I'm kind of thinking, in retrospect, and that I'm wondering if her depression was so severe, because what she did, she actually saw things. She actually she'd be playing the piano and there would be like a spirit beside her, or she would be, now, if it was, what are different thoughts on this? Teresa Caputo would say spirits can be very peaceful kind of thing, and they come and they give you messages, right? They give you messages through feathers, they give you messages through dimes or whatever. But if it's scary, for her, it was a terrifying experience. Now, was it hallucination? I don't know. But maybe that's what it was. I don't know. Yeah.
So my younger sister, she had a lot of issues, health issues.
Yeah.
She passed away last year. But I remember hearing about psychosis. She talked about it, and she had it with her depression.
Oh.
And when she drank, she would kind of go in and out of it, and she would be talking to something that was not there. But she has those hallucinations or delusions, and she was suicidal. She had attempted suicide probably about 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember her last story she told me when she was living with her partner in Toronto. That's where I was living prior to moving to the island. She was drinking like heavily, and she got to that point of intoxication where her psychosis kicked in. And if it wasn't for her boyfriend, like senior, she was on the edge of the balcony.
Yeah, she was on the job.
Yeah. And luckily we saw her and pulled her back over. But when you're like in that state, you have no control over what your body actually is.
Because it's not you.
Yeah.
It's not you.
Yeah, and I'm just like, I can't believe that happened. And yes, it's crazy.
And we don't have to get it. to know that it's real. You know, we don't have to, it's almost like we believe in certain things, we don't have to see it, there doesn't have to be, we just know that it's true. When they talk about psychosis and hearing things and seeing things, they are actually experiencing that, right? And it's not the actual person.
Yeah, and I think she went to that place because of all the trauma she had from her past. And it was just like a coping thing, and
Yes.
her brain was shutting off, I guess, from this.
Where people dissociate. And I think this for that book by the board that say is so important, because his question always is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And one of the most important things that we're going to be talking about when it comes to concurrent disorders is PTSD. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. And it doesn't have to be what we normally kind of attribute to like police officers or first responders or that kind of thing, that everybody has some kind of traumatic event or more than one traumatic event in their life. And because we are sensory individuals, smells, music, taste take us right back to places and times that if we've not resolved some of that stuff, we get triggered day in and day on day. And then you understand, I can't deal with this, I can't. Because when you're reliving this all the time, it's gotta go away, you gotta make it go away. And so you will do whatever you need to do, ingest whatever substance, or just kill it, right? And you're going to, and it's appreciating and honoring that, how hard it is for someone who actually lives. And I think there is a far greater understanding and appreciation for the impact of trauma. And it's one of those ones that I don't ever believe it's overused, or people are finally being able to say their experience, because whatever they lived is very real, right? And it doesn't have to, it could be different, depending on someone's ability. See, someone's innate character, their own personality, they could live the same situation as somebody else and not respond the same way. That two people in the same family could be sexually abused, right? One person, if they're going to internalize it, they're going to deal with that much differently. Another may handle it very, very differently, right? Yeah. That's their natures. That's when we talk about the psychology of someone's psychological makeup. Is that why is this happen? Why do people in the same family respond differently in different kinds of situations? Keep it question. And then we have PDDs, dysthymia, or persistent depressive. Is it persistent or pervasive?
You were saying pervasive.
I think it's pervasive. I better. Hang on. I don't need to guess. See, no one's perfect. That's all. You get this so understanding. Dysthymia here. Persistent, I was right, persistent. By the way, when I did, has anybody done postgraduate work? This is what I ended up looking like, right? Yeah, piles and piles and piles of stuff all over House Applicator. And then you eventually put it together into some kind of theoretical context. Okay, so it's persistent depressive disorder. So a lot of these look like, this is why being able to tweak it out, a lot of the signs and symptoms are the same, but it's how long it lasted, what's the onset, what are the variables? There was no major traumatic event for usually PDD. It's just like a depressive, and does it have to do with nutrition? You know what really controls most of our mental health? Our gut. And how well we take care of our gut. And what gets produced there. A lot of really important hormones, a lot of things that make us feel better, right? Loss of interest in that. Okay, so when we look at these, so it's the onset, how long it's there, how severe, if it's bipolar or major depressive disorder. So it's tweaking that kind of stuff out, but knowing that there's more than one kind of depression, and then when people talk about it, we have to gain more information. It's just not, oh, I'm depressed, Like what kind? When did it start? Like it's so much more. Seasonal affective disorder. See, this is why it's hard to diagnose, because people have to. There was only one person I worked with, a youth in care. I don't know if you were here, because I used to work in the child welfare system. I would never see us working. I couldn't be part of the problem if I wanted to be part of the solution. So I could never. But there was the only one person I ever worked with, but it took 2 years of working with this young person to realize, oh my God, is that this is the same thing that's happened. This is the second year that it's happened. But again, it's very hard to diagnose, because how many people have family doctors? How many people stick with their family doctors for 2 years in a row? Like, that's hard, right? So, and then to keep all those records, this is not being disrespectful to family doctors, by the way. Now, the treatments for SAD, like, and this is an important thing, that everything that you're doing as a mental health professional, not only, because if you're wanting to help them, if they're dealing with their depression by the use of substances, you have to, if you're going to take something away, this is a cardinal rule of mental health and addictions. If you're taking something away, which is their coping mechanism, what the hell are you replacing it with? That was a question in your assignment. If you're taking away your coping mechanism, what are you gonna do now if you don't have that substance? What's your plan, right? Because if you don't have a plan, so being aware of what the CBT treatment is, the medication treatments, the behavioral treatment for depression is as important, because that's part of what's gonna be part of your recovery plan. So what you're gonna do is you may engage someone, you may challenge their negative thinking, right? You don't say, don't think that. It's like you're gonna give them evidence to the contrary. If I get to know you, you just told me all kinds of amazing things about you. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm talking about the journey that you took to get here and where you are. I'm just honoring what you've done. And I will never be disrespectful and say it because I'm supposed to say it. If I don't believe it, I wouldn't say it. But you just be able, and that's what that is. That's an honest honoring of what I see as strengths and abilities and traits that you go, man, no big deal. It's like, yeah, it's a big deal, right? Now this is interesting, is that light therapy or bank lighting. It's everywhere in the college, by the way. If you go in the library, there's a bank lighting in the library and also in the teacher's lounge or the pros area, because there's an understanding a lot of people deal with seasonal affective disorder. And so what you're doing is mimicking sunlight. And so people will sit there with bank lighting. You know what people live in jail cells and there's no windows? It's interesting, where I have my clinical practice is that there's a lot of different rooms, and I have the smallest. I have this tiny little room, but you know why it's mine? Because it has a window, and it makes a big difference for me. I need that light coming in. People who live in very low, like dim lit areas, it really does create, like when you think of jail cells, and you think where people are incarcerated for months or years on end, you're creating depression, right? Because there's no sunlight, there's no daylight, there's nothing kind of thing. So this bank lighting is really important because it replicates light and sunlight. More time spent outside, but it's not just sunlight, it's actual vitamins. It's vitamin D. Now, what people are mostly deficient in, and most doctors will not unless because it costs, I think, $40 for the blood work, is to find your vitamin D level. This was the biggest argument during COVID, right? Is that people's vitamin D level. If you maximize, if you have, people take those supplements and they think they're taking enough vitamin D. People really aren't, because they're not eating enough vitamin D, they're not taking it in. But you could ask your family doctor, but it's gonna cost you if you go to NDS Labs to have, because I've had it done, is to see where your vitamin D level is. That makes a big difference in terms of your mood, your affect, right? Yeah. And so sometimes a lot of it has to do, and then we naturally get vitamin D when we're outdoors and when we get sunlight. but we also need it, we have to obtain it different ways, like I take vitamin D every day. I take, early morning, I take a supplement, I take vitamin D supplements every day, right? But, and I know because of my blood work that I'm at a maximum level, right? But a lot of people aren't, and that's the thing that happened during COVID. At the very beginning, there were a lot of, especially doctors from Ireland, and a lot of the specialists were saying that what you need to do is vitamin, they call it vitamin D, is that you had to increase these levels. And that gives your body the ability to fight off infection. Yeah. Then there's focus on nutrition, because our health comes from our gut, and relaxation exercises. And that just and a relaxation exercise, that's like yoga and breathing, and how powerful you become when you actually engage in that kind of thinking, right? Antidepressants are part of it. Okay. That's all of them, right? Okay. I don't know what time it is, but I think that's enough information for one day before people's blood explodes. Is that it?
10:53.
Huh?
10:53.
Okay, got it. Any questions about this stuff? Okay, so when you look at the umbrella, just to recap, you have the depressive symptoms, right? So you have your umbrella, not eating too much, sleeping, not sleeping enough, or suicidal ideation. You got all those depressive symptoms, and they're going to be the same for all of these, right? But there's nuances within each one of these, nuances in terms of onset, nuance in terms of how it will manifest itself, when it does, how it does. It's very different. And when you, yeah.
Is there a maximum that you can have, or you can just have as many as you bring them to you, kind of thing?
Well, you can have a number of different ones. Like you could have a major depressive disorder, and you could have depression. Like, what is your first name again? Justine. Justine was saying psychosis, depression with psychosis.
Oh, so you can have a lot.
Yes, yeah. And often what you're going to see together is depression and anxiety. You're going to see an overlapping of those two particular diagnoses happen all the time, because a lot of the medications that you're looking at have a combination of treating both depression and anxiety. Yeah.
How can we differentiate between stress and depression?
Probably by asking the right questions, right? Because stress, really, it's actually sitting with someone, and stress actually is more anxiety. Stress is more, that's actually, believe it or not, one of the easiest things to work with when you're sitting with someone, because stress is actually everything for me. Okay, has anybody ever had constipation? You know that saying, better out than in? Well, it's the same thing for mental health, is that when you take it out of here and you put it here and you're working with it, you can't do anything with it if it's going it's just spinning around. But when you take it out, and this is where you come in, you're the third party, right? Is that you take it out and you start looking at it, and you start looking at stressors, because people, when they did the assignment, the overthinking, it's like, that's ability to solve problems. Let's look at what's realistic. Let's look at what's in your control, what's out of your control. What's out of your control, let's put it over here. In your control, let's look at what actually control you have. And then it starts, you start breaking things down. I think the very first week I said, anybody can eat an elephant? Remember I said that? Is that true? No. No? Now I'm gonna ask you. No, okay, I'm gonna ask you now. How do you eat an elephant? How do you eat an elephant? You just told me you can't. Now I'm asking you, how do you eat an elephant? Close your eyes, close your eyes. Close your eyes. How do you eat an elephant? Envision it. What are you doing? Hablo español. Can you say, do you want to say it in Spanish and then you translate?
Solo que tú no puedes comer carne de tanto. Entonces tú dijiste que no puedes comer. Porque yo te dije que sí de nosotros. Y ya te dije que sí, pero no puedo.
I know you never eat an elephant, it's just an expression, so.
I can't. I can't eat.
How can you? Close your eyes. And picture. You understand, how can you eat it? If you had to eat it, how could you eat it?
Si tuvieras que comer, ¿qué comes? Wouldn't like that.
It's just a bad expression, that it is. I know you never eat the meat, but just the idea, something that big.
Okay.
How could you eat something that big?
Or get into this. Yes. As I look at it.
At first you said you can't, right? And then, okay, but then I changed the question because chances are you're more right brain dominant. Chances are you probably are right, or you're a musician, or you're creative, right? Are you all those things? Did you not do well in math? Was math, were you good in math? Yeah. But you, would you be very creative? Are you also?
No.
Yeah. That when I asked you, first of all, can you do it? And you said no. And then as soon as you said no, I said what? How? I said how? I just told you. I suggested to you without going, oh yes, you can. You know, that I said how? I suggested to you it is possible. And as soon as it's possible, you changed how you thought. You started to think in terms of how it can be done, as opposed to it can't be done. So if it's that subtle way of saying it's looking at information and it's looking at all that stuff and then kind of breaking it down and appreciating wanting all of this stuff and being gentle with yourself. And but figuring out that there is no problem so big it cannot be solved. It just can't all be solved once. You don't eat an elephant all in one sitting. So it's how, when you deal with this and knowing the difference between depression, it actually, this is the work that you need to sit with someone and go, let's find out what's going on. Let's see everything that's going on. In actual fact, maybe people are exhausted. Depression looks like exhaustion sometimes. Because when you're balancing school and work, and if you've got kids, and if you got also, when you've got all this going on, it's like, I'm so tired.
Yes.
I'm not tired because I'm not sleeping, but you know what? You don't sleep because you don't stop thinking about all the stuff you have to do, and then you start ruminating about that, and so you can't fall asleep. And I'll tell you, you can break anybody. It was a form of torture during World War II. You want to break somebody, deny them sleep.
Right.
Deny them dream, deny them the dream cycle, where you work out all your physical and emotional kinds of stuff that's going on. No one can function without sleep. I don't care how brilliant someone is. You can break anybody if they don't sleep, because all of a sudden the brightest mind will turn into a babbling idiot. And we can't function. And then we don't eat, and then we don't sleep, and it becomes this vicious cycle. And so when we actually sit with someone, we find that slow our body down, and why things like that, like yoga, why things like those meditation, deep breathing are so important, right? Why those, and then this is when we would bring in the cultural or the spiritual practices, whether where certain ceremonies that we attend. Some people will go to church on Sunday and get from church what they need. They will get the wisdom, they'll get the guidance. And this is how they balance themselves. For others, they may attend sunrise ceremonies where they begin their day, and this is how they feel very calm. For others, they will meditate. If part of their religious practice is to meditate and to, this is how they get grounded. When everything else is going on around them, they've got some kind of spiritual or cultural practice that forces them to quiet their mind and quiet their body and then they can ground themselves again and then go on. So that's where, when you're looking at someone's spiritual and cultural components come into play, if that's part of who they are, then that gets built in to the work that you do with them in terms of their treatment plan, because that's what they're familiar with, but they may have forgotten. Sorry, I've answered your question, isn't it? Not really, it's the tweaking out, it would just take lots of time, yeah. So, you good? The journey is long, I mean, this is a very personal journey, I mean, I often have to warn people that when you take this course, especially when you take it from me, is that there is that kind of introspective journey that kind of goes on, but you do it, you're not doing it for yourself. You just become the best of you for the people that actually are going to be put in your life. I don't think you go into somebody's life, I think people are put in yours, because they need you. That's my philosophy on it. Anyway, okay, you good? Are you brain dead? Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Nice seeing you.